Please be seated. Good morning. As Dave Lamott said on Wednesday, I'm blessed to be with all of you. I'm blessed to be with each one of you, and I'm blessed to be with all of each one of you. Jesus is somewhere between Samaria and Galilee. The 10 lepers in this story call out to Jesus across a line, the distance prescribed by the law because of their ritual impurity. They know their place and they know their people, the other outcasts, united by their suffering and their exclusion from the wider community. Religion and government didn't help. They had to depend on the kindness of people passing by. As Jesus crosses the border between Galilee and Samaria, maybe he and his disciples are remembering that a Samaritan town a little while back that refused to welcome him, a border that was closed to him. And maybe they wonder if this village will reject him too on his way to Jerusalem and his death. Luke writes, as he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They don't come close, and he doesn't touch them, as he often does when healing the sick. Just a word, a command. Go show yourself to the priest, which sends them on their way to do what lepers are supposed to do when they're healed. Go show themselves to the priest and get him to stamp the certificate that says they're safe to re-enter society. But while they're still on the road, they look at one another, and each one at himself, and they see that they're healed. But only one of them, a despised Samaritan, comes back to say thank you. One former leper turns back, praising God and thanking Jesus. He's so full of joy and gratitude that he throws himself on the ground at Jesus' feet, and he's talking too loud and really making a spectacle of himself. We can only imagine the disciples standing around, feeling a little uncomfortable at the display. Back on the road to the temple, the 9 lepers are obediently, I underline obediently, doing what Jesus told them to do and what they know the law requires of them. They're being good, observant, faithful Jews. Jesus wonders where they are, but we know, and we assume that he knows, that they're at the temple getting their certificates so they can go back to their lives and to their loved ones. The outsider, this Samaritan, is so seized by gratitude and joy that he turns back to Jesus, but you know, the temple isn't a place where he'd be welcome anyway, even cured of his leprosy. See, there's no cure for being a Samaritan. There's no certification by the priest that can make him acceptable. Of all of them, he has plenty of time to go back and to say thank you to Jesus. So, I don't think this is a story about the importance of thank you. I think it's a lesson in who's really an insider and who's an outsider. When Luke wrote his gospel, he shaped the stories about Jesus that he had heard into one great big story that helped an early Christian community to understand the gospel in their situation, to hear God speaking good news to them where they were, to shine a light on their problems that their community was facing. Us and them. Us and them. I was fortunate enough to be in seminary in New Haven when William Sloane Coffin was the Yale chaplain at Battelle Chapel. Some of you may know who he was. Bill was a larger-than-life figure, a civil rights and anti-war activist who sought to inspire and encourage an idealistic and rebellious generation of college students in the 60s and 70s. He used his ministry at Yale and later at Riverside Church in New York City to draw attention to the plight of the poor, to question the use of American political and military power, and to encourage interfaith understanding. Courage, he preached over the years, was the first virtue because it makes all other virtues possible. I attended Bill Coffin's last service and sermon at Yale. Walking outside after the service, it was damp, cold. was getting ready to walk back up the hill to the seminary. I crossed the street and I saw a woman huddled in a doorway. She looked sad and desperate. I asked if she was okay. She said no. She hadn't eaten, she was cold, and had no place to go. I knew that one of the old churches that surrounded the New Haven Center Green took in the homeless, fed them, gave them clothes, housed them short term, and worked to help them find a more permanent living situation. After a brief conversation, I offered to take her to the church. She immediately bristled. She backed further into the doorway. She looked straight at me and she said, "Why would I ever want to go inside of a church? I feel bad enough about myself already." Us and them. I remember my homiletics professor in seminary, Bill Meal, in his preaching on this gospel text, agreed that the 9 were fulfilling expectations and doing their duty by obeying the law. He preached that 9 went on to do as they were told, to have the priests in Jerusalem certify their cures and restore them to society. But 1 did not do as he was told. When he saw that he was healed, he cried out and turned back. It did not rest until he lay his face at Jesus' feet, praising God and giving thanks. He made a spectacle of himself. All the more so once he was recognized as a Samaritan, a believer as far as he was concerned, but a Gentile, an unclean foreigner as far as most Jews were concerned. He was, in other words, a double outsider, once by virtue of his leprosy and twice by virtue of his non-Jewish blood. A double loser, lying at the feet of Jesus and thanking God. He was one of the unclean who saw what the clean could not see and who refused to be separated from the one who gave him life. 10 were healed of their skin diseases, but only 1 was saved. The Greek is sozo, to be made whole. 10 were declared clean and restored to society, but only 1 was said to have faith. 10 set out for Jerusalem, gifts as they were told, but only 1 turned back and gave himself to the giver. 10 behaved like good lepers, good Jews. Only 1, a double loser, behaved like someone in love. He's the one who followed his heart instead of his instructions, who accepted his life as a gift and gave it back again, whose thanksgiving rose up from somewhere so deep inside him that it turned him around, changed his direction, led him to Jesus, made him well, made him whole. Each Sunday in our scripture readings, in our liturgy, in our worship, we're asked to love God. And our efforts to do so are usually expressed as in faithful actions and regular prayer. But how often do any of us really act as if we're in love? Our decorum matches our obedience, quiet, subdued, more internal than external. As good Episcopalians, we are, or at least most of us, rather contained during worship. We get a little nervous when people talk too energetically or passionately about their faith or pray with too much enthusiasm. When did our faith become so subdued, so contained? Why did we have to learn to be so quiet in church, so still, so reserved? First time I preached here a little while ago, my daughter and granddaughter, who was not yet 3, came. And it was the first time that granddaughter had been to church. And early on in the service, she leaned into our daughter, her mom, into Jordan, and said, "Mom, why is everybody so quiet?" Maybe at least once or twice, or even a few times in your life, you've known and experienced what it feels like to be the 10th leper. The one who, in a sense, has nothing to lose in turning away from the path to the temple. Organized religion has nothing to offer you or someone else. Really nothing to lose in going back to the one who made it possible for each of us to just be a human being again, a healthy and a whole human being. Us and them. The leper made whole was who turned in gratitude, even when in so many settings he's made other. He's made them. The shunned Samaritan shows up over and over again. Young African American who simply went out to the store and got shot and killed, whose parents would never hold him close again because racism still lies restlessly unexamined beneath covers of privilege. The one outside of an acceptable faith who is hearing a ban, temporary or otherwise, on people like him. A woman whose access to women's health care might be abridged or disappear altogether. Someone who is threatened with prejudice masked as religious freedom that makes it okay to bully him or her. She might be the Samaritan who's forced to carry a birth certificate in order to use a restroom that matches her birth gender. He or she could be one of the LGBTQI youth who live on the streets because they have fled or have been kicked out of their homes. Up to 1.6 million young people experience homelessness in the United States every year, and 40% of them, 40%, identify as LGBTQI. There are Samaritans of many kinds in our midst. The lines are drawn today just as they were then. They're just drawn in different places. So what do we do? How do we turn our feelings of anger and sadness into concrete practices for faith and justice? A few weeks ago, Porter talked about the shepherd who left the 99 sheep to go find the one that was lost and bring it back. Christy talked about a former student of hers who is now living on the street and who told her that one of the hardest things was that nobody looked at him. Nobody saw him. Last week, Judith talked about opening our arms wide enough to embrace and hold doubt and faith, despair and hope, darkness and light. This past Wednesday, Dave Lamont talked to us about how change happens, embracing a movement story rather than a hero story. In the hero story, as Judith said at the start of our service, our role is to wait for the hero to come and solve the crisis, and then we applaud. In the movement story, we as a community are actively engaged in the process of change, creating and becoming the movement, an instrument of God's peace. We are, I believe, here at St. James, at a threshold place. We are, I believe, a very special community. A community become actively engaged in the process of change, creating and becoming an instrument of God's peace. Someone once said that whenever we draw a line in the sand to exclude others, we find that Jesus is always standing with those on the other side of the line. Bill Coffin once wrote, "I love the recklessness of faith. First you leap, and then you grow wings." At Bill Coffin's last service, we all expected some soaring rhetoric, a call to arms for justice and love. But instead, this civil rights and anti-war campaigner who used his ministry to draw attention to the plight of the poor and disenfranchised, who is constantly challenging all of us to love the recklessness of faith, to leap, and then to trust that we would grow wings. Instead, William Sloane Coffin walked over to the piano, he sat down, and he started playing, and he started singing. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. May God give us grace to risk something big for something good. Give us grace to remember that the world is too dangerous for anything but truth and too small for anything but love. The faith to leap and trust that we will grow wings, and the courage to shine and become God's light in the world.